the Mohawk That Wouldn't Quit. If you have never heard of this series, then first of all, what are you doing? Why are you watching this video? Go check out that series right now. Just pause the video and go and check out the series. I linked the entire playlist in the description so you could go see it right now. In fact, I can even put it in the eye in the corner so if you also need to go in there. So go on, check it out. Go on. I'll give you 5 seconds. Okay, so if you're still here, then either A, you've already seen the Mohawk That Wouldn't Quit and already know what it's about. B, you just came back from watching that series, in which, congratulations, you now understand what I'm talking about. Or C, you just completely ignored me and continued to watch anyway, in which case, I guess I'll explain it. The Mohawk That Wouldn't Quit is a 6-part Trainz series that was created by Ron the Cyborg, although back then he was known as Big Al Productions. It follows New York Central L4A Mohawk number 3124 on a cross-country journey to escape the Cutter's torch, all the while trying to avoid all the diesel bounty hunters that are trying to drag him back to the scrapper. It's a legendary series that has countless remakes, videos inspired by the series. It was even going to have a sequel called Tracks of Rebirth, and then that got cancelled. I'm a big fan myself and have recently been on a TMTWQ kick. I wanted some form of physical model of 3124. Originally, I wanted to try to seek out Broadway Limited's L4A Mohawks, as they actually produced 3124 in that lineup. The problem? They don't sell them anymore. And no matter how hard I try, I cannot find a single Mohawk on the aftermarket. Not one that's either reasonably priced or broken. It's starting to get to the point where I don't even care if it's 3124 or not, because I could just simply slap a new number onto there anyway. The best I could ever find were apparently these key imports HO scale Mohawks, except the problem was that the seller had no way of testing the model, so for all I knew, I could be purchasing a broken model. So if I can't get an HO scale 3124, what other options do I have? And then I made Little Mountain. If you haven't seen the video how I built that, here's the link to it in the corner. The long story short, I used the techniques used by Big City Studios customs and applied them to my own model. And though that was a learning curve experience, I now have a baseline idea of scratch building. And that's when it hit me. If I couldn't find a 3124, I'll just have to make one. And thus, a new project was underway. Here is how I made 3124 from the Mohawk That Wouldn't Quit. For the locomotive chassis, I used a wooden railway Murdoch as a basis, simply because this was the only wooden railway character I had that had a 6-wheel bogie. However, instead of having a single swiveling 6-axle bogie at the back and one pair of wheels at the front, I opted to have 2 6-axle swiveling bogies on either end, as I felt that the engine would be too squished if I just used the regular chassis. So after getting those dimensions, I cut out a few pieces of cardboard, glued them together, and covered them with masking tape to hide any cardboard bits that might be sticking out. Then I poked holes through the chassis, and then we're gonna do something a little bit different, as this time, instead of painting the entire model after construction is completed, I opted to paint each piece at a time to avoid getting paint in places where I didn't want paint to be. Although for a locomotive that's completely painted in black, that's not really going to matter, but for future projects, if I do make any future projects, it will indeed matter. It also allows me to go ahead and paint certain details that wouldn't be accessible once they're fixed to the model, and you'll see examples of those later. The paint I use is Apple Barrel Matte Black. Once both bogies were painted, it was on to the wheels. Same technique as last time, I traced around the glue stick to get the wheel shape and basically cut them out. Although I had to do it twice per each wheel to make it the right thickness. Yeah, I had to do that 40 times! To not only account for the locomotive wheels, but also the tender wheels, as I figured I might as well go ahead and make those while I was at it. But once they were all cut out, I glued together 2 pieces per wheel, half of which ended up getting cut up Q-tips as the axles, and then I wrapped them all with the paper-like cardboard on the rims of the wheels, to help the wheels be a lot more smoother. And then I realized that the holes on the chassis were poked too close to each other, making the wheels not fit right. So I ended up covering up those previous holes with masking tape and just poked new ones. Much better. After that dilemma, it came time to paint the wheels again, and I guess repaint the chassis where the masking tape had to be added, I suppose. But once that was done, I decided to coat all the pieces with Mod Podge. I did this because I noticed on Little Mountain the paint would come off very easily without the Mod Podge, and I have heard the term seal the deal with Mod Podge when it came to making customs, so I gave it a try here. Although I was quick to be warned not to put too much Mod Podge on the parts, as apparently that could cause it to fog up. But once the Mod Podge was added, it was time to put the wheels into the chassis. Once again, however, like Little Mountain, I noticed that the wheels were a little bit too tall for the chassis, to the point where they had scraped the bottom of the body, so I ended up cutting out some more cardboard and adding them on top of the chassis. Then came the magnet holders. Same process as the wheels, except this time I traced around the magnets I'll be using and cut 3 out per magnet holder instead of 2, and I glued them to the ends of the chassis. You may also notice in this image that there are toothpicks glued to the top of the chassis. I'll get back on that. For now, let's talk about the frame of the chassis. I ended up cutting out 2 rectangular pieces, except no, they're not perfectly rectangular, as once again I didn't want there to be a running board. And by that I mean I didn't want there to be a running board at the bottom of the boiler, because you'll notice how on American locomotives the running boards are on the sides of the boiler, not towards the bottom. And I wanted my model to reflect that. The parts that do stick out from the rest of the frame will be designated to the pilot and where the cab will be. Now we can go back to the toothpicks that stuck out from the top of the chassis. Originally, the way I was going to make the chassis swivel was by poking holes out of the frame and having the toothpicks go through it. And while this did work, there was another problem. Because the toothpicks stuck out over the frame, it would mean that they would conflict with the rest of the body, especially the boiler, which I will be using a wooden dowel for. And at the time, I didn't have any means of cutting a chunk out of the wooden dowel. So I came up with an alternative plan. Instead of the Q-tips being glued to the chassis and poking through the frame, they'll instead be glued to the frame and poking through the chassis. This did mean I had to remove the tops of the chassis again in order to gain access inside. Although that part didn't end up coming into fruition anyway, because the stoppers wouldn't stay in place when the glue was drying. So as of now, the chassis are technically loose on the bodies of the engine and tender. But I mean, the locomotive's gonna stay upright anyway, so as long as I'm mindful to grab the chassis whenever I'm picking it up, it should be fine. But that's besides the point. The point is that even with this change of plan, the chassis does still swivel very freely. And now it was time to give it a test. While not the best performer, especially around those tighter radius of curves, it does get the job done. So we can move on to the rest of the body. I started off with the cab. I cut out a few pieces, glued them together, especially the roof where it had to be curved, covered it in masking tape and glued it to the body. And then came the boiler, which I used a wooden dowel for that was cut down to size, and then I covered it in masking tape. The next part was painting the entire thing black. Once the paint had dried, I drew some details onto the locomotive using paint pens, this being the smoke box door and the cab windows. For anyone wondering, these are the paint pens I used for the project. Then, after a coat of Mod Podge, it came time to make the running board. I cut out some strips of cardboard. Meanwhile, I also ended up cutting out other pieces of cardboard to make... okay, I'm not entirely sure what these parts are on the side of the engine. On one side, there's just this giant cylindrical tank. I think that's supposed to be the air reservoir tank. I'm not 100% sure, though. And on the other side, there was what I initially thought was an air compressor. But the air compressors are on the front of the engine where the smoke box is, so I'm not sure. I mean, this could still be an air compressor, but I'm not too sure. But whatever the case, I ended up making pieces for them. The air reservoir tank, if that's really what it was pretty simple. Just roll up a piece of cardboard and cover it in masking tape. The, what I'm assuming is another air compressor, had 3 pieces that basically did the same thing, just not as long. And then using those previous pieces as reference, I ended up making the parts of the running board that stick up to accommodate those pieces. Then all of that was painted black with Mod Podge applied afterwards, and were glued to the body. Now before we move on, let's deviate slightly and take a look at the tender. I used this generic bogied truck as the basis for the tender. The chassis construction was basically the same for the locomotive, except this time it's 4-wheel bogies instead of 6-wheel bogies. Then I cut out 2 rectangular pieces for the frame of the tender, glued them together, and covered them with masking tape, with Q-tips sticking out the bottom for the chassis to sit on. And then it was time to test it out. Admittedly much better performance than the locomotive. Then I glued the walls of the tender on, and this time I made sure to keep the scale with the locomotive so it's not oversized. And from there I basically just added on to the tender until I got the shape I wanted. You may notice I added this top piece where the coal would go, and I'll explain that later. But once the tender had got its shape, I covered it in masking tape and began to paint it. And then realized I completely forgot to add this part that sticks up at the back of the coal load. But that aside, the main body of the tender was complete and painted. Then I made the water tank hatch and rear headlight, which used a paint pen to make the actual light part, and glued them on. Now when it came to the coal load, I used Big City Studios' technique of filling the back of the tender with hot glue. And this is why I added that top to the tender, so that way I only just had to fill the top part of the tender with glue, and not the whole inside of it. And then as it was drying, I used cut-up Q-tips to mold the glue into the shape of coal. And then once it was completely dried, I simply painted over it. Although this time I didn't apply Mod Podge, just so I could keep that matte look. And voila, we got coal. And aside from the lettering, the tender is basically done. So let's head back to the locomotive, shall we? To make the headlight, I just basically cut out a strip of cardboard and rolled it up. Then I took a very small piece of the paper light cardboard and wrapped it around the top of the headlight to simulate the headlight visor. And then using a paint pen I painted up the lens. Along with the headlight, I ended up creating the number board and the New York Central logo that goes underneath the headlight. Although there was only enough room for the number board, so the New York Central logo got scrapped, but I don't think it takes away from the look. Then I created the feed water heater, which basically used the same process as, again, what I'm assuming to be the air reservoir tank. And then I also cut out these tiny squares to act as the supports for the feed water heater. While making the feed water heater, I also ended up creating the funnel, after which I glued both of them to the top of the smoke box. Okay, complete side tangent, but the look of the actual L4A Mohawks always looked off to me, as in they didn't look too identical to 3124, and I couldn't put my finger on it for the longest time. But now I get it, there's no feed water heater! Don't know why the L4A Mohawks and Trainz has it, but I consider it one of the most iconic features of 3124, so I added it on anyway. Heading towards the back of the cab, for some reason, it does end up going up slightly there, so I ended up modeling it. And also made sure it wasn't too wide to the point where it covered up the window detailing. Then came the domes of the engine. The two rearmost domes were the exact same process as the funnel. It's just one had painted detail on the top to represent safety valves and whistles, and the other was just simply taller. As for the bigger dome, it was simple to put together, just simply gluing it together while also having to bend some pieces into the proper shape. The only major thing I had to do was cut a round shape into the bottom so it could rest on the boiler perfectly. Finally came the smoke deflectors, which I cut into shape and simply bent the top of them so they can angle inwards, and glued them onto each side of the locomotive. Then came the magnets, which I glued onto both sides of the engine and tender. Although, as you'll see later, I ended up adding extra magnets off screen, as just simply one magnet wasn't strong enough to keep the engine connected to its train. Then I went on to Adobe Illustrator where I created the decals. Once I printed them out, I cut them out and glued them onto the model. I also gave them a coat of Mod Podge so they can match the rest of the look of the engine. And the last thing I ever did was glue 3124's number onto his cab. And with that, the model is finished. And I believe there's only one proper way to reveal this model. So let's do a little remake, shall we?
Can't take me, James. Gotta fight another fight. I gotta run another night. I'll get it out, check it out. I'm on my way and it don't feel right. I gotta get me back. And that's a fact. It's okay, I'll find a way. It ain't gonna take me down, no way. Yeah. Don't judge a thing till you know what's inside it. Don't push me, I'll fight it. Never gonna give it, never gonna give it up, no. If you can't catch a wave, then you're never gonna ride it. You can't come uninvited. Never gonna give it, never gonna give it up, no. You can't take me, I'm free. Why did it all go wrong? I wanna know what's going on. What's this holding me? I'm not where I'm supposed to be. I gotta fight another fight. I gotta fight with all my might. I'm getting out, so check it out. You're in my way, yeah, you better watch out. Oh, come on. Don't judge a thing till you know what's inside it. Don't push me, I'll fight it. Never gonna give it, never gonna give it up, no. Catch a wave, then you're never gonna ride it. You can't come uninvited. Never gonna give it, never gonna give it up, no.
Having just escaped the scrapyard, here is New York Central L4A 3124. Once again, I am really happy with how this model turned out, even with being able to engineer the swiveling bogies, although, as I've stated, they're not properly attached, so they do have the tendency to fall off like that, but it's not a big deal to me. And as you just saw in that remake, I did buy these coaches from Quality Trainz and More to go along with 3124, as these do resemble the coaches he hauled throughout the entire series. I also did end up buying the observation coach and the baggage coach, just so that if I ever wanted to use these coaches for any other purpose, I could have those on the train too. Because of his free swiveling bogies, of course, he can in fact multi-track drift, and the tender, that's on a couple of the coaches, the tender can too. Multi-track drifting Mohawk. Anyway, yeah. For comparison, here's Little Mountain next to the Mohawk. And, yeah, he's pretty big. Both lengthwise and, not including the Little Mountain funnel, height-wise. But, I mean, it makes sense since Little Mountain's supposed to be a primitive little thing. I mean, he's supposed to be tiny, so, yeah. Once again, however, I managed to make a model that breaks the loading gauge in terms of height when it comes to the domes, and especially when it comes to the co-load. He's also very wide compared to the average wooden railway engine. However, the way I like to think of it is that this is technically in scale with all the wooden railway stuff, especially when it comes to British engines. These American engines are a lot bigger than British engines and break the British loading gauge. Hank can tell you all about that. However, when it comes to American engines in this scale, they are shrunk down so they can fit the loading gauge. I guess you could think of it like 00 scale and HO scale. When it comes to turning, 3124 does pretty well on the broader curves. However, when it comes to the tighter radiuses, that's where he begins to struggle to make it around. Okay, that time he was able to do it pretty well, but most of the time, his bogey comes off the track like that, and especially when pushing backwards. It's not the smoothest. Initially, when it came to climbing hills, the engine and tender didn't perform pretty well, but that was simply because I hadn't added the extra magnets yet. But now that I'm testing it here, it actually does it pretty well. Let me try doing it the other way. Yeah, he actually does it pretty well. He only got caught there because this top bit was sticking out. But yeah, that's how I built 3124 from the Mohawk That Wouldn't Quit. Not sure about future appearances for this guy, because of course he's not my original character, he's someone else's. This is just me making a fan model of it. The only times I can think of him ever appearing is if it's like a cameo, or if it's something to do with the Mohawk That Wouldn't Quit. Nothing really plot relevant, as again, he's not my original character, and I don't feel like I have the right to use him. But yeah, that'll just have to do it for today's video. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoy. Wait, what? Yeah. Well, hey, wait, where are you going? What the? Oh, right, you're still on the run from scrap. Oh, so I guess that's how part 2 starts. Well, anyway, guys, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.